So, welcome to our lecture today. The lecture today is on Stonehenge, Nazca lines, and the Moai, victims of pseudo-archaeology. And so these three topics themselves are the subject of sensationalist stories and what I term pseudo-archaeology. And you've probably heard of Stonehenge or the Nazca lines or the Moai, and they always make an appearance in these shows on the History Channel or A&E or wherever. They're always talking about who could have built these. The largest, most well-known of these sort of sensationalist stories is a program called Ancient Aliens, which started in 2009 and is still being produced. It runs through 15 seasons, which is crazy, which means, in fact, that there are 2 seasons in a year. And so the episodes themselves talk about essentially ancient societies. The pilot episode presents the views of author Eric von Daniken, who we'll talk more about in the next lecture, who theorized that advanced beings from another world visited primitive humans, gave them the knowledge of the solar system, concepts of engineering and mathematics, which became the basis for their religions and cultures, as he claims are evidenced by ancient monuments such as the Nazca lines, the pyramids of Giza, and the Moai of Easter Island. And here is a preview of sort of their introduction.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet.
July 20th, 1969. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to land on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Just like aliens visiting from another world. It had been the stuff of science fiction. Now, everything that could be imagined seemed possible. If mankind could travel the skies and go to other planets, why couldn't beings from other planets visit the Earth? Amidst a wave of modern UFO sightings, a new theory emerged that aliens visited Earth in antiquity and were regarded as gods. But if that were true, wouldn't there be proof? Perhaps there was. All we needed to do was open our eyes and our imaginations. The proof, perhaps, was all around us.
Yeah. So, Ancient Aliens, the series. So yeah, you've probably heard of it. I know that it makes up a meme, I believe. At some point, it must be aliens. So who did in fact build Stonehenge? Well, Stonehenge itself is part of a larger phenomenon that happens throughout Western Europe and the Mediterranean. So starting around 4000 BCE, or about 6,000 years ago, we start seeing these what are called megaliths, which are large stone monuments, appearing in Great Britain, Mediterranean, and the Atlantic parts of Europe. And these megaliths last for about 2,000 years. So they're in use from about 4,000 to about 2000 BCE, which is sort of the beginning of sort of the Bronze Age. And most of these megaliths we know belong to that period because they were dated through radiocarbon analysis of associated artifacts. So when you sort of move them or you dig around them, you'll find artifacts in situ with them, and then you can date those artifacts using the principles of superposition, right? And so we get a sense of how old these are. They were not built by aliens. They were in fact built by Neolithic farmers. And so remember, the Neolithic is the origins of agriculture. And so in Europe, what we find is these constructions are associated with the arrival of agriculture and the development of agricultural technologies. So, but why, and sort of how did this come to be? Well, in 2019 there was a great project done by some DNA experts, and they examined DNA from sort of across Great Britain, and they looked at Neolithic human remains. They looked at some of the stuff before, some Mesolithic human remains, and they looked at a little bit of stuff afterwards, but broadly focused around 4000 BCE with a couple outliers. And they compared the DNA with, compared DNA extracted from Neolithic human remains found across Britain with those of people alive at the same time in Europe. And what they discovered was that there is sort of a shift that occurs. So we have Neolithic farmers in Anatolia, Turkey, essentially dispersing outwards from Turkey and taking their Neolithic strategies with them. And so they eventually replace these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain. And this is a phenomenon that you can track archaeologically, but it's interesting that we can actually see it in the DNA record as well. And this replacement occurs around 4000 BC, which is the same time in which we see the construction of these megalithic stone, things like Stonehenge and stuff like that. The crazy thing is that when you analyze the genetic markers, you can actually get a sense of what they might have looked like based off of what genes are expressed and what genes are there. This is what a Mesolithic individual of Great Britain looked like. So this is a reconstruction of a guy by the name of Cheddar Man. And so Cheddar Man was a hunter-gatherer in England, in Cheddar, England, and the DNA results suggested that he would have had dark skin with blue or green eyes, right? So this really challenges the concept of what it means to be British. So one of the oldest individuals in Great Britain is in fact a dark complexion with blue eyes, right? Remember, this notion of race doesn't really have much of a biological component to it, so this is the bonkers stuff. As I mentioned, he had dark skin, blue or green eyes, and he would have had lactose intolerance, because the ability to digest dairy comes with the secondary products revolution in the Middle East after the origins of agriculture, and it spreads with these Neolithic farming communities. Interestingly enough, with Cheddar Man, when they compared his DNA with some of the modern individuals living in that area, the DNA of a modern man, Adrian Target, who is 84 years old, matches that of Cheddar Man. So essentially, this genetic fingerprint is said to have been passed down from mother to child. So in other words, Target and Cheddar Man share a common maternal ancestor. They both share a common mom. And it may be added that Target is not the only one of his family to have not moved away from his ancestral homeland. It's reported that there were 46 individuals in his extended family, most of whom have remained in the Somerset area of Cheddar. So this guy is distantly related to this individual, Adrian Target, whose family has not moved since 9100 BP, which is when essentially he dates to. So really, really old. So they, like I said, they compared the DNA sequence mostly with the Neolithic, but they did look at some outliers. So this is what Mesolithic Britain looked like. It looked like this guy. This is what the Neolithic Anatolians look like. So these are the individuals who migrated out from the region of Turkey, modern-day Turkey, and they brought with them their lighter skin, their brown eyes, and their lactose tolerance, their dairy ability to have dairy products. And so we see these individuals essentially moving across Europe. So here we have essentially our Anatolian farmer, and so she and they are moving more or less along the coast. They're also moving up through the Danube River Valley, which is this region right here, so they'll move up the Danube River. And so they eventually replace or marry into or breed into the existing Mesolithic populations. The crazy thing about this is that this also coincides with the spread of these henges. So it seems very much like these henges, the Mesolithic Europe into Neolithic Europe, the arrival of these Neolithic populations coincides with the construction of these megalithic stone structures, and particularly across the Atlantic seaboard and up along this direction. And so we find them all along here. It's pretty amazing. And this definitely points towards what is considered to be a coastal route of the movement of agriculture into Europe. As I mentioned, there's another route in which you see agriculturalists move up the Danube River Valley. But the crazy thing is that we don't see megalithic stone structures with the Neolithic period in this region, right? So it's very much, the construction of these megalithic stone structures is very much associated with the coastal distribution and migration patterns of this particular group of Anatolians along this way, as opposed to the other group of the Neolithic folks who would come up through the Danube River Valley, which is just amazing that we have that level of specificity. So there are different types of megaliths. So one is called a menhir, and a menhir is just a single standing stone, such as this. An alignment is a collection of menhirs in a linear arrangement. Your book doesn't actually use the term alignment, they just call it linear arrangement, but it is also an alignment, and so we can see them right here in a row. You get a dolmen, and so your book refers to these as different tombs. A dolmen is a generic term for a megalithic tomb or chamber with a roof. Your book describes passage graves, which are types of dolmens. So they are a megalithic tomb entered via a long, narrow passage that opens into a wider room, generally near the center of the structure. And they also describe gallery graves. Gallery graves are megalithic tombs that lack an entrance passage. The burial room or rooms form the entire internal structure. The last type is the type that you probably have seen or heard about, and those are henges. So a henge is defined as an enclosure, usually a circular ditch and bank system up to 50 meters or 1,600 feet in diameter. So the largest menhir anywhere in the world is in Brittany, France. And it's this giant guy right here. So it's broken into 4 pieces. It stands 75 feet tall or 23 meters in height, or it did, which is about 6 stories. And it weighs an astonishing 350 tons. So it would have looked something like this. So you can see here's the bottom half down here, and then the top half is right here. The best example of an alignment is in Carnac, also in France. There are about 3,000 stones in a series of 13 parallel rows stretching over about 4 miles long. Each row itself is about a mile long, and each stone is about 5.5 tons, or approximately 3 moderately sized cars. Folklore suggests that, they used to think that it was sort of Caesar's army frozen in place. Some people thought it was a battle memorial. Some people think it's a religious landscape. Others think it has an astronomical purpose. We don't actually know really what it was used for. Right, so here's our dolmen, a megalithic tomb with a roof. Here's our gallery grave. And here's our passage grave. So that's your background on all these types of megaliths. So what is the story with Stonehenge and Salisbury Plain? So Stonehenge is a pretty unique thing. It's on the World Heritage List. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this is a picture of what it looked like in 1877 before it was really really taken care of. And so in 1915, a British aristocrat by the name of Cecil Chubb purchased the henge as a gift for his wife. By 1918, it was donated to the government. We don't know the circumstances surrounding why 3 years later it was donated to the government, although I'm sure that would make for a very good Downton Abbey style documentary or drama. And it was in 1986 placed on the World Heritage List. So Stonehenge itself is constructed over a 1,500-year period, stretching from 3,000 to about 1500 BCE, so from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, comprised of about 159 stones, the largest of which weighs between 30 and 45 tons. Itself is a system of stone circles, ditches, banks, and avenues. But the stones only form the center of the complex. There, as you look here on this map, you can see, or on this picture, it's actually just this center part right here. There's actually a whole lot going on outside of it with these ditches and avenues. So the construction, more or less, is in 3 phases. So in this picture, we have 3100 BCE. So we get what are called these Aubrey holes, where sort of holes that were placed into the ground. We're not entirely sure what they were used for, but the circle, the diameter of it is 320 feet with our avenue. Then by phase 2, 2100 BCE, we see some of the first stones put into place. The avenue is widened, and by 2000 BCE, really the Bronze Age, we see really its full expression with all these different holes, these different circles, the heel stone, they call the slaughter stone, all these different aspects of it. South Barrow, North Barrow. It's so, like as I mentioned, built over several phases. It's composed of what are called trilithons. So trilithons essentially are these two vertical stones with the capstone on top. And obviously, before it was thought that that little skill was actually involved. However, when you take a look at it, there's actually a lot of skill involved. The stones themselves are subtly shaped such that they look like they are level to the ground. When in fact, if you look at them closely, they're actually worn down such that they form an optical illusion. They're actually curved, but they look straight. They also have these lintels, which are the top parts up here, have grooves and notches in what's called a mortise and tenon joint. So this is essentially a little notch right here that the lintel will sit on top of. You would need, it's estimated, for phase 1, you would need about 450 person days worth of work to construct phase 1. Phase 2, you would need about 15,000 person days, or about 40 years worth of work. And phase 3 would need about 73,000 person days, or about 200 years worth of labor. The cutting and movement of the stones alone is estimated to have taken about 2,300 years of person days. So if one person were to work on this, it would take them 2,300 years of to complete that. One person was doing it. So it's just really astounding, right? So, this is the mortise and tenon joint. And there are a couple different theories as to how it was constructed. So the idea is, the basic one is this. So these stones were rolled over onto logs. There was a ditch dug, and then they used these levers essentially and pulleys to raise them up into place. From there, they would essentially set up some scaffolding in which you would little by little raise the lintel all the way up until you got to the top, and you would place it on there. This is another sort of idea, is that you essentially put a lot of dirt here and then you would slide it up that way, although this way doesn't seem to be the one that most people think about. Right, so various hypotheses, right? Are they burials? Well, there's no people buried underneath these things. Treasure? No. Sacrifices under stones? No. Magic powers? Well, certainly associated with religion to some extent. Here's a good picture of what it might have looked like raising the stones up. There are, in fact, two types of stones. So the larger outer sarsen circle was made from local stone. The inner circle, these are called blue stones. And they actually come from southwest Wales, and each one of them, of which there are 80 in total, weighs about a ton. Like, well, how on earth did you get these stones, and how do you know that they came from southwest Wales? Well, you can do chemical testing of the stones, and you can link those stones with the chemical signatures in other stones. And so they were able to trace it back to what are the Preseli Mountains in southwest Wales. And then they were also able to trace the sarsen stones up by Avebury, the Marlborough Downs. So the blue stones were thought to be removed around 2500 BC, and so they essentially were carted down the mountains and then to essentially the riverside, and then the coastline, in which they would have hugged the coast along this way by raft, and then put on a raft and taken up the Avon River till you get to where Stonehenge is. So there are a variety of different hypotheses as to exactly how they did it, but the general idea is that they were carved down and then moved by raft from southwest Wales, which is approximately 240 miles. Not an insignificant feat for a Neolithic population. Remember, Neolithic populations don't have social stratification, right? So these are people coming together on their own to do this without anybody really directing it. So what is the story behind Stonehenge? Why was it built? In the 12th century, they thought of Stonehenge as being built by Merlin. So Merlin was the wizard, right, of King Arthur's court. So this was Geoffrey of Monmouth thought that it was built by Merlin, who was Merlin being a druid of the Celtic religion. In 1650, a fellow by the name of Inigo Jones thought it was built by the Romans because there's lots of Roman architecture all across England, and so England was in fact a Roman province. But that's not the case. In 1740, a fellow by the name of William Stuckley believed it was associated with a Druid temple, so the Celtic Druid belief system, that it was somehow associated with that. Interestingly, it's sort of the most recent interpretations involve astronomical alignments and some sort of religious system. So in the late 19th century, they started to observe that it was organized, or it was arranged in such a way that the sun would rise above what's called the heel stone. So here's the heel stone right here. So on the 21st or 22nd of June each year, the dawn sun rises directly over this heel stone. When the weather is clear, the first sunlight passes across the heel stone and through the double standing stones at the entrance. Essentially, it bisects the two horseshoes of the standing stones and reaches the altar stone at the very center of the circle. Today, the sun just misses the exact top of the heel stone as a result of small changes in the Earth's axis since the monument's construction. In the 1950s, Gerald Hawkins discovered that there were at least 19 astronomical alignments associated with it, and suggests that perhaps the circle of holes may have been used for creating calculations. So here is a zooming in of the different events. So here you can see from this position, the winter solstice sunrise, the minor southern moonrise, minor standstill northern moonrise, and then here's the heel stone right here where the summer solstice occurs. From this position, you can also see the summer solstice summer solstice sunrise in this direction. Summer solstice sunset. So you get different. Here's the winter solstice sunset. These are the Aubrey circles on the outside. So if you're looking this way, summer solstice sunset, winter solstice sunset, summer solstice sunrise. And this is what it looks like over the heel stone. It's pretty amazing. The latest theory has it being involved with something called a sacred landscape. And there's a whole field called landscape archaeology in which you examine how cities, buildings, and the landscape all interact with each other. And so a fellow by the name of Mike Parker Pearson argues that Stonehenge is part of a sacred ceremonial zone that was built during the Neolithic, and that it's linked between the River Avon and several ceremonial avenues, and is linked up to a town called Durrington Walls. And so in Durrington Walls, you actually have a woodhenge. You also have a number of, you have a Neolithic village. And so the idea is that at Durrington Walls, you have this woodhenge, which is the living, and at Stonehenge, which is stone, is the dead. So this idea is that there's a connection between the woodhenge and the Stonehenge, the living and the dead, and that these avenues connect the two, and that this idea is that essentially when somebody dies, they would be placed on this boat and go down the river to Avon, and they would be buried down in this area. And so Stonehenge serves as an important burial ground from its earliest beginnings for several hundred years. So we do find burials in the Stonehenge area, not in Stonehenge proper, but in the area. And so it's part of essentially an entire sacred landscape. There's different avenues, there's different henges. This is essentially the town of Durrington Walls, and Stonehenge is down this way, and this is the River Avon meandering this direction. And let's see here if I can get these videos.
We're stood at Durrington Walls, which is a really large henge monument in the Stonehenge landscape. This is a really important monument because it's where we believe that the settlement was, where the builders or possibly the users of Stonehenge lived. The houses were down at the riverside end of the henge, and what they discovered was small square houses, each built with stakes for walls, with chalk plaster floors, and with central hearths. Amongst the houses, there was lots and lots of middens or rubbish dumps, lots of animal bones, lots of broken pottery of a type we call grooved ware pottery, sort of flat-bottomed pottery with incised lines of decoration on it. And from this we can gather that the people here were gathering for large feasts. They seem to have had so much meat that they were throwing away bones when they still had meat attached to them. The settlement seemed to have only been in use for about 50 years, and then after that, people seem to have built this huge henge monument to enclose the area where the settlement was. We don't know why they built the henge, but it might have been to monumentalise or to remember where the site of the settlement had been.
So that's sort of the settlement there, and
We're
then
stood at Darrington Walls, which is a really large...
this is the henge itself.
We're standing at Darrington Walls, which is a huge henge monument. A henge is a type of earthwork enclosure built in the late Neolithic period, and it's defined by a bank with a ditch inside the bank. They're usually circular. This is one behind us is one of the largest in the country. In the 1960s, there were some really large excavations here, and they found two timber monuments. One they called the Southern Circle, which was a bit like Woodhenge. It was some concentric circles of timber posts. The other monument they found they called the Northern Circle, and that was a simpler circle of posts, approached by an avenue of stakes with a fence line or a facade in front of it. Excavations here at Darrington Walls found an avenue or a roadway leading between one of the wooden monuments, the Southern Circle, and the River Avon. It was sort of a packed metal roadway and seemed to have been used by people to process between the Southern Circle and the river. So it's quite interesting because this monument has parallels to Stonehenge. Stonehenge has an earthwork avenue linking it all the way to the river, and this monument also has an avenue linking it to the river. So it suggests to us that the river was really important for these people. We're standing at Woodhenge, which is a monument about a mile and a half from Stonehenge. And this is a wooden version, really, of Stonehenge. The concrete posts behind me represent individual wooden posts. Some of them would have been up to about 9 metres tall, so like huge telegraph poles. The monument would look quite dramatic. And around the outside of the wooden posts was a henge monument, so an earthwork bank and ditch that enclosed the wooden monument. The site was excavated by a lady called Maud Cunnington and her husband Ben. And what Maud and Ben found were these 6 concentric ovals of posts, and amongst them lots of finds: broken pottery, animal bones, bone tools and pins, flint tools. It seems to have been a ritual monument of some kind. The objects that were deposited at the monument were placed in particular patterns that looked like people were coming in to a certain area of the monument and perhaps processing around in a certain way, depositing things as they went. The dates that we have from Woodhenge aren't perfect, so we do need to do a bit more research, but we think that Woodhenge was built at around the same time as Stonehenge, and it was probably built by the same people who were building over there.
So as you can see, Stonehenge itself is not just one thing. It's a very complicated landscape, and the quote is, at midwinter, Pearson envisions the passage from life to the place of the dead for the deceased members of society. Perhaps the dead were brought to Woodhenge, the standing tree trunks, the living world, and then transported down the River Avon in a passage to the place of the dead, arriving finally at Stonehenge itself. So that's from your book. So Stonehenge really shouldn't be viewed in isolation. It really should be viewed within the larger context of the landscape, of the Neolithic landscape. If you want, you can actually go, I'll post this up, you can go and explore virtual Stonehenge. So, right, so this is the virtual Stonehenge page. You can scroll down, and you can see the skies above Stonehenge. So the virtual tour. So I'll post this for you to explore, but you can, right, so you can see, here's the avenue. You can explore all the different aspects and get more information about Stonehenge. And I'll give you a little link about it.
The avenue here behind us is probably the processional routeway by which prehistoric people approach.
So it's pretty amazing. English Heritage, which manages the property and is the big governmental entity for essentially archaeology of England, has done a great job of that. So that's Stonehenge, right? So Stonehenge was made by people. What about Nazca? So I had mentioned the Nazca in the lecture about South America. So you remember the Moai and Sipan are up here, and then there's the Nazca lines to the south. So here's the Nazca are roughly contemporaneous with the Moai. So here's Moai, Tiwanaku's starting to develop, and then we get the Nazca folks down here. And they stretch from about 200 BCE to about 500 CE. And so they're in the Nazca Valley of southern Peru. The largest site is a site called Cahuachi, where you get adobe platforms and courts. You get a large stepped pyramid, these beautiful polychrome ceramics. And as I mentioned, they are contemporaneous with the Moche. They are best known by the lines, or the technical term, geoglyphs. So here's a polychrome ceramic vessel right here, found on the southern coast of Peru. And the geoglyphs date to about 200 BCE, although that is a challenge. And they're known as geoglyphs because they're drawings on the ground made by removing rocks and earth to create a negative image. The rocks, which cover the desert, have oxidized and weathered to a deep rust color, and when the top 12 to 15 inches of rock is removed, a light-colored, highly contrasting sand is exposed. Because there is so little rain, wind, and erosion, the exposed designs have stayed largely intact for 500 to 2,000 years. And we see common Nazca designs. So here we have I believe this is, can't really see it, there's a bird, and then there's a bird up here. Here we've got a hummingbird, here we've got an ant. Pelican or pelicano, manos, which is Spanish for hands, ballenas, araña, which is an ant, and monos. So monos are monkeys. Monkeys do not exist in the Andes. So here we have an example of a connection with the lowland jungles of Brazil. We even get people. So here on the side of this mountain, we get this guy. Right. So if you look carefully, here you can see his head, his two eyeballs. Here are his legs. He almost looks like a cartoon character. And this is what they look like from the ground. So what is the purpose of them? Aliens, well, we don't really have any aliens. The Cossack-Reich theory is a 1960s theory proposed in which you have an astronomical or calendar event to it, but it seems likely that most of the lines do not point at anything on the geographical or celestial horizon, but rather lead to places where rituals were performed to obtain water and fertility of crops. And so that is the theory proposed by Johann Reinhardt in 1986. And so it's essentially associated with water and rituals. He says, our discoveries clearly show that the straight lines and trapezoids are related to water, but not used to find water, but rather used in connection with the rituals. The trapezoids are big, wide spaces where people can come in and out. The rituals were likely involved with the ancient need to propitiate or pay a debt to the gods, probably to plead for water. And so the idea is that they would walk along this path, and we find artifacts essentially associated with offerings along the sides of these paths. And the thing is that the common misconception is that they can only be seen from space, but you can actually see these glyphs if you're on the side of this mountain right here. Like you can walk and through the hillside and you can see these things. They're not just only seen from space. So these are made, the Nazca geoglyphs are made by the Nazca people as part of their ritualistic water activities. Last and not least are the Rapa Nui. So the Rapa Nui is essentially the term for Easter Island. So Rapa Nui is what they call themselves, the natives call themselves. Easter Island is the term that was used to describe it when Jacob Roggeveen first discovered them essentially on Easter Day, April 5th, 1722. Easter Island itself is about 64 square miles, and it is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's 1,400 miles east of the Pitcairn Islands and over 2,000 miles to South America. So it is as far away as you can get, but if you think back to our lecture on the peopling of the Pacific, it was one of these islands that was established by the Polynesians. And when we think of the Pacific, right, we often think of tropicals, we think of Hawaii, we think of birds, we think of all these beautiful stuff. But really, Rapa Nui is in fact a temperate climate, and it would have looked something like this. Now, there aren't any trees left on Rapa Nui, but at the time we do have archaeological evidence for widespread palm trees and widespread birds. This is the island itself, and you can see the distribution of what are called Moai, or the statues. And so they are all essentially on the coastline. Rapa Nui is a volcanic island, so there's 3 extinct volcanoes. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here. The volcanoes provide the raw material that is used to create the statues. So the general history of the island is that around 1200 BC, we see the arrival of the Polynesians, and they bring with them some interesting things. They bring with them domesticated chickens. They bring with them either intentionally or as stowaways brought what's called the Polynesian rat. And anytime you can more or less check the arrival of humans on an island in Polynesia based upon when the arrival of the rats get there. There's limited farming, and there's offshore fishing. So there aren't any coral reefs around Rapa Nui. So what they have to do is they have to get into boats and go pretty far offshore to get some more of the deep sea fish, things like tuna, things like whales, dolphins, those sorts of things. They can't do shoreline fishing. And they eventually develop chieftain-level societies, complete with Moai petroglyphs and wood carvings. And so the traditional interpretation is that they essentially overexploited their environment. The argument is that they cut down all these trees that they needed to make these giant statues, and that each one of these chiefdoms were competing with each other to outdo each other in terms of statues, and essentially they overexploited their environment. And then that led to no trees, which led to soil erosion, which led to crops essentially failing, and the complete collapse of their society. Poor Rapa Nui is really the poster child for environmental mismanagement. But now there is a new effort to sort of rephrase that, and new evidence is really starting to come to light. So one of it has to do with the role of the rats. So the rats who came to Rapa Nui with the humans, the rats themselves were influential in the deforestation because the rats would eat a lot of the nuts that were needed for trees to grow. So these nuts would fall to the ground that would normally then take root and then regrow, but essentially they ate all of them. And so you see just widespread lack of growth. And so the idea is that, yes, they did cut down trees, but no new trees were growing back because the trees couldn't grow back. The rats essentially prevented them from regrowing. There's also the image of when the Dutch explorer Roggeveen discovered, right, when he met the Rapa Nui, he describes them as these sort of sickly-looking individuals who came out in a boat that barely held water, and so the implication is that the population decline and the collapse was due to this overmanagement or mismanagement of the resources. However, it appears that he wasn't, in fact, the very first one there. There are accounts of earlier people, at least one European colonist showing up on Rapa Nui before Roggeveen's most famous encounter. And whenever Europeans show up anywhere, particularly in the Pacific or in the Americas, they bring along with them the diseases. So essentially what Roggeveen was discovering when he showed up was an island already ravaged by European diseases. And so the story is changing as new evidence comes to light. Here's a map of the traditional clan districts of Rapa Nui. So here we can see sort of the traditional areas, the different zones of where these different tribes and different clans lived. So where do these crazy statues come from? So Thor Heyerdahl in his Kon-Tiki voyage showed that you could sail from South America to Polynesia. He says that perhaps these are South Americans who brought with them, but it's not backed by any evidence of a link between essentially between South America and there's no link that these South Americans, as we saw in the Peopling of the Americans, people of the Peopling of the Pacific, that these South Americans made that voyage. Aliens? Is there any evidence for aliens? No, there really is no evidence for aliens whatsoever. It's just not. Yeah, they're just not there. Really, they are the result of competing chiefdoms. This is one of the ones that's on the Moai that are on display at the British Museum. So the statues of Rapa Nui are composed of the Ahu, which is the ceremonial platform, the Moai, which is the ceremonial body and the head, of which there are over 900 of them, and they all face inward, with the tallest being a fellow by the name of Paro, who is about 33 feet high and weighs about 82 tons. And they are all made of basalt, volcanic rock. And most of them were toppled after European contact, not before. The idea is that civilization was collapsing, and the Rapa Nui started toppling them over in widespread warfare, but it turns out that those in fact were toppled after European contact. They are thought to be essentially deified ancestors, Aringa Ora Ata Tepuna. They have what are called living faces, or Aringa Ora. Their eyes are made out of coral, and then their pupils are made out of obsidian or red scoria. This hat up here is called a pukao, and the pukao represents the top knots of the chieftain's hair where their mana, or their sacred essence, is stored. This is a different stone, essentially made from a different part of the body. The pukao is actually made from red scoria. Here we can see them on the ahu, which is the ceremonial platform. So they have their backs to the sea, facing inward. Here's another one, a collection of them. We find some of them still in place, so in various stages of construction. So this is the quarry at the Raraku volcano. So you can see them dotting the landscape here. That's where the volcano is. Here is an incomplete Moai. So you can see them still being carved out of the ground. So here's a face right here. Here's a face right here. So there's always this question, right, of how did they move them? The oral tradition argued that that the power, the magic, was used to walk them. Thor Heiderhall suggested that they were dragged on a wooden sledge. William Malloy suggested that they were essentially doing this sort of sheer movement in which essentially they had this triangle right here, and then they were sort of shifted back and forth. Eric von Daniken of Aliens fame suggested that the aliens transported them, right? And Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo think that they were in fact walking, and that's actually what it turns out to be. So when what happens is they would raise them up, and we've found they would raise them up, and then essentially they would sort of walk them like a giant refrigerator to the coastline. And what they find is they find markings up here on the top of the Moai that correlate with ropes. They also find wear and damage down here at the base of them, associated with essentially chipping of it being walked back and forth. And you don't see any wear and damage associated with sort of the stomach or perhaps the backside, in which you would expect to find with them on if they were a wooden sledge or using this sort of sheer movement. And the crazy thing about this is that the experimental archaeological evidence, because these things are all done through essentially giant experiments, and then you match that experiment with what you find archaeologically on them, is that number 5, the Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo walking archaeological approach, matches the oral tradition. So the people didn't believe, nobody believed that they said, oh, how could they walk? They can't just magically walk there. But it's crazy because this oral tradition of them walking matches up with what we find archaeologically, which is pretty amazing. And so you're like, well, Tom, okay, that's great. These are all things. Why do you get so up in arms about people sort of, who cares? It's an ancient alien show. It's really, really funny. These things, whether they are the Nazca lines, whether they are Stonehenge, or whether they are Moai, mean a lot to people. They really do. And so to do that, to pretend that it's aliens and not people, really is really hurtful. So here we can see.
Give us a chance so he can come back.
A tearful plea from the governor of Easter Island for the British people to give back their soul.
You have keeping him for 150 years. Just give us some months and we can have it.
What she means is this 7-foot sculpture, which sits in London's British Museum and not on the remote island off the coast of Chile, where it was first created by islanders between 1100 and 1600 AD. This delegation is on a trip to the UK to formally request its return. The carving is one of the native Polynesian emblems, named in the local language ancestors and lost or stolen friend. It was taken from the Easter Island in 1868 and presented to Queen Victoria, who passed it on to the museum. It's one of the many artefacts British explorers and dignitaries acquired from around the globe that are displayed here. Recently, a number of these treasures have become subject of intense debate and requests for return by their countries of origin. Among them, the Grecian antique statues known as the Elgin marbles and the Benin bronze from modern-day Nigeria. Easter Island has offered to swap this one for another sculpture by a contemporary local artist.
So here you can see, I mean, it really is, it really does.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help.
Okay.
This sentence is grammatically.
So really, the reason why I talk about this and the importance of this is that these things often appear on shows such as Ancient Aliens and various YouTube channels, and they serve to dehumanize the people who created them, robbing them of their heritage and identity. So when we talk about folks such as this, right? This is an ancestor. This is somebody's sacred spirit. This could be your parents, your grandparents, your great relatives, right? So this is important. So to sort of pretend that they are aliens, that aliens must have made this, is to deny humans their humanity and the genius of these different groups and these civilizations. And with that, I will see you for one more lecture.